Hi everyone, this is Tim Guy again. I want to make a video here to talk a little bit about the video that we watched for this third section in this course and just some of my thoughts about what I saw in the video and some of the readings that we had to do. Also, right after Super Bowl, go Eagles, wear my Eagles sweatshirt, so really excited about that. So first off, in the looking at the videos and thinking about what the role of the teachers was in those classrooms, the teachers in those classrooms were definitely more in a facilitator role rather than what I would call the dictator, I'm in charge role. What I mean by that is that these teachers set up things for students to work on. So, like the one teacher had the butterfly garden going on, the other teacher had a Socrative seminar as like the center of their classroom, and they kind of had the students be more in charge of what was they were learning and they were doing, while they more kind of stayed back and kind of made sure things were running smoothly. If students had questions, they answered them. They directed the conversation how places should go. And a big thing was that they posed questions for students that would make sure that they were kind of headed in the correct direction, were making the right conclusions of what they wanted them to learn. So, like in the butterfly garden, they had like a mural they were doing, and the one teacher who had a really nice sense of style, I don't know if anybody else noticed that, but he kind of was asking questions about some of the different butterflies that they saw and kind of was directing that student towards some of the conclusions he wanted that student to come to. And it's kind of all almost comes out organic, and the students almost kind of come up with the learning themselves, as opposed to the teacher kind of sitting there giving them notes and making them come up with those conclusions. Similarly, the Socrative teacher kind of posed the questions to begin with, but then the learning kind of organically came from the students discussing it. And he just kind of monitored what was going on and made sure to guide it the direction that he wanted. So as you can see in my picture here, that's kind of what some of the challenges is that sometimes we go, all right, well, I want this to happen. I want my students to be independent, learn all these things, and then you still teach them like you're the dictator. So I thought that was kind of a funny cartoon there. The role of the students in the classroom, I kind of touched on this a little bit with the teacher, but they were in charge of the class, really. The teachers set up things for them to do, kind of told them what they were going to be doing, but then the students were the ones who really were in charge of their learning and kind of took everything to that next level. This is what I like to call student-centered instruction, where the students are the ones doing the work, they're the ones doing the learning, the teacher is more of a facilitator and kind of helping out with that. The students, like in the butterfly garden, were exploring different things in the garden, we're seeing different things, we're coming up with different conclusions about the butterflies, while in the Socrative seminar, they were talking about the slave issue and Reconstruction and bringing up their own perspectives and kind of coming up with their own conclusions based off that. And the biggest thing about the role of the students is having it be so centered on them and having them really being the driving force behind the instruction was able to make sure that they were engaged at all times. The kids were all really excited about the butterfly garden and were coming up with really great conclusions. And even in the discussion, Reconstruction era could be a really boring topic if it was a lecture, but those students were actively engaged and were having really great arguments about, hey, why were these the decisions that people made and how did we come back together after such an awful Civil War? So some of the things that I see as a benefit of having a student-empowered classroom, let me move that so you can see a little bit more on my slide here. When you have a student-empowered classroom, which, student-centered classroom, I always like to say empowered because the students feel like they're in charge of their learning and they are the ones who are driving instruction, is that you really can have a much higher level of student engagement. In a traditional direct instruction classroom where the teacher is more of the dictator as opposed to the facilitator, you are going to have students who may not be as focused and engaged and really enjoying what's going on. We can all think back to when we were in high school or middle school when we had a teacher who kind of just talked at you and just told you all the information, how boring that could be. And even if it was something you're interested in, it's not necessarily the best way to get information. It's very passive. And whereas when you have a student-empowered classroom, the students are actively doing things, they're engaged. It's a much better setup for student engagement in that way. Also, you have students end up doing most of the work. You can get into a situation, especially because I teach math, and this is totally true in math, where if I have a passive classroom where I'm the dictator and I am in charge and giving the notes every day, the students don't do as much work that way. They're not the ones who are doing all the stuff and learning the material. I'm doing it, and I already know how to do it, and it's not helping them to grow and kind of learn that material better. It's also really a great way to encourage students. It kind of goes a little bit back to that engagement, but almost more towards the motivation track, where it's a lot easier to have students look really good in front of their friends. And what I mean by that is that when students are empowered in your classroom and when they are working simultaneously with other students on things, you can kind of make students look good by either giving them the right answers, or their peers kind of help them get to the right answer, or through discussion they might feel more empowered to talk about something. In the second video about the Socrative, I think the teacher did a really nice job talking about the different levels that those students were on in his classroom, and how through discussion some students who maybe didn't read as well or write as well still felt like they could bring up their points and have a position to defend. And I think that that encouragement of students and being able to make them kind of feel better about themselves and feel smart in a classroom is really important for building that motivation piece. Now, while there's a lot of great things about a student power classroom, there's definitely some things that to think about, and these are things that I sometimes struggle with in my room. Especially with my pre-algebra students who are more students who aren't necessarily inclined to like school or like math. I find that when I do a lot of things that are more student empowering, the motivation for students sort of can lean the wrong way. So are they motivated to do their work, or are they motivated to socialize? What is more motivating for them in that instance? So if I have students and I say, hey, I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes, I want you to work on this problem and then check with your partner, how often does that become, hey, I worked on this problem for maybe 20 seconds, and then for the next minute and a half I talked to my partner about what video games they were playing, and I didn't actually get the problem done or figure out what was happening. And that's definitely a struggle for me, is how to get students motivated to want to do the work and see sort of the growth that they can have. And I think some of that's really definitely tied into a growth mindset and building that into the students about where they can go. Also, one of the other big concerns, and this was something we talked about in the first kind of chapter as well, our first readings, is when they're sharing content, is that content accurate? Are students spreading correct information, or are they spreading misconceptions? When you have to be really on the ball in terms of guiding that instruction and having eyes and ears around the room, because if you are not doing that, and then you find out that students were not telling each other the correct steps when you had them do a turn and talk, and then students were not helping each other in the correct way. Maybe a student was just having a student copy off them and their work's not right. Now that student doesn't really know what to do. There's a lot of things that can go on in there. And I know for my sake, I have a little bit of an easier time because I have a co-taught class with those students. So it's a little bit easier to have two sets of eyes and ears going around the room and figuring out what's happening. But it's definitely still a challenge in terms of making sure students are accurately sharing information with each other and not kind of making the problem worse. Now, something that really does help with that, though, is technology. I actually have iPads for all my students in the room, and that can really help keep that content accurate. Instead of just having the students work with each other and discuss things, they can work with each other and check something on their iPad that maybe can give them the correct answers, or they can share more collectively, everybody together, either using a poll app or Nearpod or different apps that are out there, and then they can see kind of the group consensus and maybe be like, oh, well, Joe told me to do it this way, but that's not how everybody else is doing it. What's the difference there? Maybe catch themselves a little bit more with that. It also creates something what at my district we call learning without limits environment, where when students have constant access to an iPad or some sort of one-to-one device, they're more likely to be able to kind of almost have organic learning experiences where, hey, I don't remember how to do this, but I can go Google it and figure it out. Or, oh, this thing on the American Revolution is really interesting. I'm really excited about, this person in the Revolution. Let me go do more research on that. And you can really create some more organic organic learning environments by having that access, sort of that computer at their fingertips to help them maybe answer their own questions and reach out on those things. Also, technology definitely increases engagement in the material. You can have more different things you can do with students that don't necessarily mess up the structure of your classroom. You can have like video games that they can play that kind of can help them do some math facts. You can have different communication devices through iPad, different communication apps that can help them kind of add a new layer to the classroom and give them a little more engagement and new things for them to do. In my room, I definitely try to implement a lot of this student-centered approach. I have my students sitting in pairs. It used to be groups, but I found that was almost too much for students in terms of socializing. It gave them too many opportunities to kind of goof off. So now what I do is I have them in pairs, and I try to, in the beginning of the year, set a ground rule of we're going to practice working together. So the first couple times we do it, I show them exactly what kind of interactions I want them to have, and I show them the consequences for when they don't have those correct interactions. Now, I'm not as consistent, I think, as some of the videos we watched like last week, and that's something that I think for next year, and even with this group currently, I need to kind of work on to help build that correct interaction. But I think that practice is really important for getting them to understand this is what a correct communication between me and my partner actually looks like. I also try to give them very directed times to do that. So, here I do what's called a turn and talk a lot, where I do teach math. There has to be some direct instruction, but I'll often say, hey, spend 30 seconds explaining to your partner what we just did. Go ahead and turn next to the person and show them how you do this. Everybody, after we did this problem, spend the next minute, turn to your partner. And I give them very strict timelines. You have a minute. Everybody repeat those directions back to me. Go ahead and do that. Let's talk about what just happened. And it tends to be a way to structure that interaction and still have it be student empowered, but get them to the places where I want them to go. And then also some of the other things that I definitely have is kind of implemented in my room is different structures that I'll use depending on how I want students to interact. So stations, I have this really cool app called Nearpod that allows students to virtually interact with each other. They can treat it like a whiteboard and they can see each other's work, and it's a really great way to have students empowered in my room and really working together and using those social constructs to my advantage. The one big thing about when you have these student-empowered classrooms is, are you being accessible to all students? And I will say that watching that video and looking at these two classrooms, I think the Socratic classroom was not necessarily accessible to all students. And what I mean by that is if you're not an audio learner or somebody who has a good time or really the discussion sort of thing is something that would come through to you, that classroom is not going to work for you. And through some of the readings that we did in this chapter, talked about RTIs, or being able to identify specific needs for a student and what are the instructional things that you do that affect students. And it talked about a lot about how you can identify learning disabilities by if those instructional things did something for them, do they then have a disability? And if it doesn't, if you keep trying things, then maybe evidence-based learning doesn't work for them and they might have a disability. And I think that when you have a student-powered classroom, you kind of almost have to think about it in terms of, are you actually supplying the things that are helping those students who maybe need a certain intervention in order for them to do well? So I think that in order for this to succeed, you have to look for students' needs, and you have to be able to fulfill those needs, whether it's guided notes for them when they're doing that, maybe set questions to help them get started in their discussion. Maybe after the fact, maybe everybody else just hears it and they get it, and for them, they get kind of like a printout of here's what we talked about, here's some things to fill in. And I think that that's, depends on a student-by-student basis. What does each student need in order to be successful? And again, those accommodations, I'm always a big believer that the accommodations for students who have a learning disability, who have a need in your classroom, those things should enhance their learning, not make it simpler. Those accommodations should be things that help them get to the same place everybody else is at, not, hey, let's just dumb this down and make them do, the easier stuff and then it'll be fine. So those are some of my thoughts about the videos that we watched and some of the readings that we did. I would love to hear from you guys about any kind of strategies you use in your classroom. I'm always looking for new ways. With math, it can be really hard to get out of that I'm the one in charge. Here's the lesson. Here's the material. Everybody take these notes, and I can do a lot of, here's a problem, you do a problem. Here's a problem, you do a problem. But even that sometimes is not as engaging to students as it could be. So I'm always looking for ways to improve engagement and have my classroom be more student-centered. Thank you guys for watching this video. I appreciate it.